for, and it was very well received. And he was talking about a topic that was important then, and it's even more important now, the separation of church and state. Rob is a senior advisor at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and he's the former editor of Church and State. He now runs the monthly membership magazine. He's also a chief writer for Americans United Wall of Separation blog, which is very interesting, and I would encourage you to look into that. Rob has written 4 books on the topic of separation of church and state. His most recent one is Taking Liberties: Why Religious Freedom Doesn't Give You the Right to Tell Other People What to Do. Specifically, Rob will be talking to us today about the separation of church and state relative to schools and the funding of schools and the point of view about private schools versus public schools and how they're each funded. So we look forward to a great presentation. Again, put your questions in the Q&A, but we will not be addressing them, or Rob will not be addressing them until after the presentation. Rob?
Thank you very much, Louise. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you again. This afternoon, I am going to be speaking about the public education system, the role of religion therein, questions of funding of religious schools and private institutions. I'll be touching on that. And I will speak from the perspective of someone who is very supportive of the public education system. And it sort of saddens me that I have to do that, that it is necessary to defend our public education system. But in fact, it is. There are various types of critics and forces out there that seek to either Christianize public education as they define Christianity, which would be a very conservative, fundamentalist type of Christianity, to bring that into the schools and have that appear in all the classroom lectures. And there are other organizations and individuals out there that are advocating for a privatization model, where essentially public education would, in some of the most extreme cases, be done away with entirely, and we would rely entirely on private education funded through a state system of vouchers to educate our children. I think both of these approaches are a mistake. I think our public education system is, in many respects, an American success story, one that we should be proud of, and one that we should hold up, lift up, and support as much as we can. And as I talk today, I'm going to be discussing some history of public education in America. We'll be talking about some questions about religion and, of course, the funding matters. One of the things I would ask you to bear in mind is, given our nation's racial history and the problems we have had in that arena, for much of the history, when I'm talking about public education, I'm going to be talking about a system that served white children. Now, this is an unfortunate part of our history. It's a disgraceful part of our history, but it is our history. For many years, public schools, after they were first conceived and began to catch on, did not admit Black students. And we had this myth of separate but equal schools, which, while they might have been separate, were never equal, until the Supreme Court's desegregation decisions. So for much of our history, we are talking about a system that was exclusionary. And as long as that was, we do know that eventually that was corrected, and our schools still have some work to do in that area, but we do have a system now that is open to all students, regardless of their racial background, their national origin, their religious beliefs, if any, their sexual orientation, what their parents are like, their income levels, and so on. And this, I think, is something that we really should be proud of, despite the attacks we do see on the system. One of the reasons that I look at public education as an American success story is the fact that right now, as we're speaking today, that system is educating 90% of our children. And that number has been consistent for quite a while. Even after COVID and some of the other things we've experienced recently, we still have public education educating the vast majority of American children, 90%. And about 90% of Americans right now have a high school diploma. So the numbers there are pretty high. Now, literacy, you see different figures for that. Literacy is calculated in different ways, and depending on how strict of a criteria is applied, literacy numbers can fluctuate, but by some measures, they're also all hovering around 90 and into the low 90s. Now, historically, these figures were a good bit lower. Consider this, for example. In 1940, only 26% of the population had a high school diploma. 1940, not really that long ago. In 1950, it was up to 34%. In 1960, 41%. In 1970, 55%. In 1980, 67%. In 1990, 75%. 2000, 80%. So now we're up to about 90%. So you can see that continued growth there. And there are a lot of reasons why that high school graduation rate continued to increase. One of them is that the nation began to take a lot more seriously the idea that its young people should at least have a high school education. That was not always the case. If you think back into the early days of our country, really education was something that the children of the wealthy might have enjoyed. They might have received some instruction at home or some private tutoring. The nation at the time of the founding, after the revolution, after the adoption of the Constitution, and we're sort of getting our foot on the international stage as a separate country, having broken with Great Britain, at that time, the idea of public education hadn't really caught on. There weren't a lot of people talking about that, but eventually they did start to talk about that. The very first public school, actually, despite what I said a minute ago, does date from an earlier time, 1635. That was founded by the Puritans, a Boston Latin school. But this, again, was an institution that educated only boys. So it really couldn't be called public in the sense that we think of public education today. These were the children of the elite, young men being educated. So even though it was supported with some public funds, it was not really a public school in the sense that we think of those institutions today. That concept of a public school that would educate the masses was slow to catch on. Thomas Jefferson actually proposed a system of public education in 1779. He had an idea, and this reflected the thinking that was common back then, of a two-tiered system. One track would educate the children of the wealthy and the elite. And the other track would focus on the children of everybody else, who was basically the vast majority of the population, laborers, farmers, people who work with their hands, who were outside of the professional class it was perceived to be at the time. So this was a very elitist model with this two-track system. But at least it would have provided some education for everybody, even if it was segmented in this way. But it didn't catch on. It's a concept. Jefferson talked about it. He introduced it in the legislature, but it didn't pass. Remember, American society at this time was largely agrarian, farm-based. Children were often needed to work on those farms, to work at home. People had large families at an age before there were reliable forms of birth control, so children might have to tend to their younger siblings. They had a lot of work to do. So education was very sporadic. If parents could afford education at all, they might only be able to afford it during certain times of the year, not when they were all at the height of their work on their farms. But after the Civil War, something profound and interesting started to happen that really dramatically changed the nature of the United States. And that is rapid industrialization and the growth of large cities. Immigration was also increasing at this time. So you had a lot of people now not living on farms, not working on farms, and children not needed to be in those institutions. And obviously we had child labor back then, so maybe they were doing other types of work. But at the same time, there were people who started saying, well, why can't we provide some sort of system of education for these young people, whether they are children of immigrants or they've been here a long time? Some system of education for them was needed. So Massachusetts in 1851 passed the first compulsory education law. Other states began to follow suit, most of them after the Civil War. But again, remember, these laws, which did require some type of education of children, were limited to white children. Back then, people didn't use the term public schools. They called schools common schools. So you see this term throughout the 19th century, common schools. Horace Mann led efforts to create a system of public education, common schools, in Massachusetts in the 19th century. And Mann had an interesting perspective in that he believed that education should be widely available, hence the common nature of it. But almost immediately, there were questions about what role would religion play in these institutions. Now, think about what the country was like back at that time. A largely Protestant nation, different denominations, and certainly we were seeing waves of immigration from countries where there were a lot of Catholics, but still heavily Protestant country. In some parts of the country, still under the sway of some pretty conservative religious denominations. A lot of people in a still somewhat pre-scientific age believing in the absolute literal truth of the Bible. That was the type of atmosphere you had as these schools began to arise, these common schools. So naturally, there were a lot of people who just kind of assumed that there would be religious instruction in these schools, and it would reflect the dominant religious view, which was conservative Protestantism. But Horace Mann, at least in Massachusetts, had a different view. He thought the Bible could be used in schools, but he argued for it to be used in a non-sectarian way. Now, the question of whether you can do that, whether you can teach the Bible in a non-sectarian way, is debatable. So that particular idea of his never really caught on. Instead, states began adopting different types of models for how to deal with the question of religion. In many states, the school experience would open with some type of devotional. The Lord's Prayer was frequently recited, and there might be readings from the King James Version of the Bible. Now, think about those practices. Recitation of the Lord's Prayer and reading from the King James Version of the Bible. What do you notice about those? They are fundamentally Protestant practices. And it wasn't long before some tensions started to arise about these things. I mentioned earlier that it was really a post-Civil War phenomenon, the rise of common schooling in America. But there were examples of it prior to the Civil War. And in those schools, there was tension over the role of religion and whose prayers would be said and which version of the Bible children would read from or hear passages from. One of these particular incidents came to a rather violent culmination in Philadelphia when in 1844, Catholic parents protested because their children were being compelled to listen to a Protestant prayer and readings from the King James Version, Protestant version of the Bible in school every day. The Catholic parents didn't ask that these practices be stopped. All they asked for was that their children be excused from them. So they wanted like an opt-out. But even that was enough to flare tensions. Now, there was a lot going on in this part of the country at that time. Tensions were high because unemployment was high and immigration was high, and people were angry about immigrants taking jobs. I mean, an old story. So these tensions boiled over, sparked by the question of how religion will be dealt with in Philadelphia's common schools. And when word got out that the Catholic parents had made this objection and that the school board might allow it, there was an extended riot that lasted several days in an area of Philadelphia then called Kensington. And several people were killed. Some churches were torn down, burned, and some other Catholic facilities were also assaulted and attacked. So the tensions were really boiling over in some parts of the country because we couldn't find a way to accommodate everybody's religious expression in public schools. And of course, we're talking here about primarily Christian expression anyway. Catholics were upset about these Protestant exercises, and nobody was even thinking about what Jews might think or people who were of other religious faiths. This was largely being played out as a fight between different denominations of Christianity. These types of fights and battles arose in other states as well, usually not as violent as what we saw in Philadelphia. People decided instead that they would not riot, but they would go into the courts. At this time, church-state cases tended to be resolved in state courts, not the federal courts. So people began taking these challenges into state courts and saying that the school's sponsorship, the common school's sponsorship of religious exercises every day was a violation of the rights of young people. In 1869, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that the state's common schools were not required to sponsor prayer and worship. Now, that court didn't say it was illegal for the schools to sponsor prayer and worship, merely that they were not obligated to do it. In Illinois, the state Supreme Court ruled in 1910 that school-sponsored prayer and Bible reading and hymn singing, which happened in some of the schools, was a violation of the state constitution. Courts in Nebraska and Wisconsin issued similar rulings around this same time, late 19th, early 20th centuries. However, in some other courts, these practices, these religious devotional practices, were upheld in common schools. So you had a patchwork of experiences. Depending on where you lived, your schools might be sponsoring Protestant prayer every day or no prayer, or they might have an opt-out mechanism. It just varied depending on where you lived. Eventually, it was decided that there needed to be some kind of a national standard. So in the early 1960s, the ACLU felt that it was time, the time was right for a national challenge to school-sponsored prayer. This is coming after the period of the 1950s, where there had been a lot of religious conformity and the use of what you might call civil religion. In 1954 is when "In God We Trust" was named the national motto and stamped on all of our money. "Under God" put into the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, some of these sort of generic uses of religion by the state sprang not from the founding period, but from the 1950s. But in the 1960s, some of you may remember, the cultural winds were shifting in a little bit of a different direction with the rise of more, how shall we say, free-spirited attitudes about these things. So it seemed like it was right, this was the right time to bring this challenge. The first case was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1962, and it came out of the state of New York. New York had a body called the Board of Regents. Their role was to oversee public education in the state. The Board of Regents passed a policy allowing public schools, if they wanted, to have children recite a prayer every day that the Board of Regents itself had composed in conjunction with a supposed group of multi-faith clergy. Now think about this for a minute. This is a government body that has composed a prayer, and they're going to tell children to say this every day, or at least listen to it every day. Now, schools in New York didn't have to use this prayer. They had the option to if they wanted. One of the districts that did was the Herricks district in Long Island. They adopted the prayer. They began reciting this and having children recite it every day. Some parents were offended by this. Some of them were Jewish. Some of them were members of ethical culture or Unitarian. They just felt that it wasn't the state's job to compose prayers or push prayers onto their young students. So they sued. When the case reached the Supreme Court in 1962, the court ruled 6-1, because there were a couple of vacancies on the court at the time, that the prayer was unconstitutional. The name of this case was Encore versus Vitale. So that was the first of the school prayer rulings. Now, around the same time, There were other challenges to school-sponsored religious practices bubbling up in the courts. In Maryland, a woman named Madeline Marie O'Hare challenged practice in the Baltimore public schools of reading from the King James Version of the Bible every day. At the same time, in a suburb of Philadelphia, a young man named Ellery Shemp challenged his school's practice of having prayers and readings from the Bible broadcast over the loudspeaker every day. And in 1963, the Supreme Court consolidated those two cases, the one from Maryland and the one from Pennsylvania, decided them jointly under the name of Abington Township versus Shemp, and struck down these school-sponsored religious practices. Now, it is important to remember that these were coercive practices, not voluntary. And as I've mentioned, they were Protestant in nature. In Pennsylvania, the state law mandated that the schools read 10 verses every day over the loudspeaker from the Holy Bible. But that was almost always interpreted to be the King James Version of the Bible. Ellery Shemp, the high school student who got this case rolling, got it started by volunteering to do the reading one morning over the loudspeaker. Now, this was quite a surprise to the principal of the school because Ellery was known to be an opponent of these Bible readings, but the principal thought perhaps he had changed his mind, and he allowed Ellery to do the reading. Ellery began reading from a Koran. He was sent to the principal's office and threatened with expulsion. And that gave him the standing, of course, to challenge the matter in federal court. Now, in the aftermath of these rulings, there were several attempts in the U.S. Congress to attach a school prayer amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So some type of an amendment that would bring these religious exercises, these school-sponsored religious exercises, back into the public schools. Of course, none of these amendments passed, although they were a topic of a lot of discussion throughout the 1960s, and a couple of them even had votes in Congress. But remember, it takes a supermajority to pass constitutional amendments, so they didn't pass. But then the issue resurfaced in 1980 during the presidential campaign between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. And by the way, Jimmy Carter turns 100 years old tomorrow. During the 1980 presidential campaign, Ronald Reagan campaigned partly on the idea that he was going to have a school prayer amendment attached to the U.S. Constitution. Jimmy Carter was asked about this at a press conference. Jimmy Carter was a devout Southern Baptist, responded, "I think the government should stay out of the prayer business." So he made his views clear. But as we all know what happened, Ronald Reagan won that election and did, in fact, advocate for a school prayer amendment. Now, the president's ability to advocate for constitutional amendments is limited. They have to arise in Congress, and it's Congress that will vote on these amendments. And of course, if it passes both chambers of Congress, that then goes out to the states. So while Reagan could advocate for it and get speeches in favor of it and do other things, he relied on members of his party to push the school prayer amendment in Congress. They did. There was a vote eventually in, I think, 1986, and of course it failed. It was not part of our Constitution. The issue resurfaced again in 1994 when the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives. Newt Gingrich, who was leading the House Republicans at the time, advocated for something he called a religious freedom amendment, which went beyond just school prayer and would have weakened the separation of church and state in many other ways. That amendment knocked around Congress for a few years. Eventually there was a vote, and again, of course, did not get the required number of votes to pass and faded away. School prayer amendments are still promoted and introduced sometimes. It's kind of a pro forma thing now, but they still happen. So where are we now? Well, the Supreme Court has been stepping away from church-state separation, much to my dismay. And Christian nationalist groups believe that they can push the envelope on these questions of the role of religion in public education again. So we're monitoring several areas at Americans United right now, and I want to touch on some of those because these are the sort of things you may be seeing in headlines or hearing about. The focus has really moved into these areas when it comes to the role of religion in public education. First would be supposedly private prayers led by school personnel, but that are actually coercive and that involve students. In 2022, the Supreme Court handed down a ruling in favor of a high school football coach in Bremerton, Washington, who was praying at the 50-yard line after the games. He claimed this was a private prayer. But if you look at the video footage and news photographs that were taken at the time, he's surrounded by students, players, members of the school band, and kids who have come down from the stadium. The school offered to find a place for him to pray privately after the games, but he insisted on praying at the 50-yard line. Well, then the school offered him the opportunity to pray at the 50-yard line a few minutes after the game, after everyone had gone home. He could have his private prayer, but no, he had to do it right away. And the reason he was doing this was because he wanted students to join in with him. And at least some players from the court record felt coerced, that if they didn't pray with the coach, they wouldn't play in the game. So this was a problem. Now, this school was sued by this coach when they told him to stop these prayer practices. And he got help from a Christian nationalist legal group. Americans United defended the school. We knew that it was going to be a very difficult case to win, that it was going to be an impossible case to win, most likely. And sure enough, it was. The court, with a 6-3 conservative majority, ruled in favor of the coach. The court bought into the fiction that these were private prayers. But the court did not overturn the school prayer rulings from the early 1960s that I talked about. So while it's a bad decision, it could have been a lot worse. Interestingly, the football coach in this case, after making such a big fuss about this situation, insisting that all he wanted was his right to pray, moved away from Washington State, relocated to Florida, and isn't even involved in that school district anymore. So one has to wonder if this whole case wasn't really just kind of a bit of a setup by groups that dislike separation of church and state to erode some of the precedents in this area. So that's one area that we're following and looking at. The second would be the display of religious documents like the Ten Commandments in public schools. Some of you might have read about Louisiana, which became the first state to mandate the posting of the Ten Commandments in public schools in recent times after Governor Jeff Landry signed the bill into law in June 19th. Now, Kentucky had passed a law like this some years ago, but was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1980. So many years later, we see the state of Louisiana deciding it wants to relitigate this matter. So, of course, they passed this law. Americans United, the ACLU, and the Freedom from Religion Foundation is challenging it in federal court. The plaintiffs in our case, which is called Work v. Brumley, include parents and members of the clergy. They assert that the law violates Supreme Court precedent, which I mentioned earlier, the 1980 case, and the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment. Now, we know that cases like this can be difficult to win right now, but as we are talking here today, the current precedent at the Supreme Court does say that the posting of the Ten Commandments in public schools is unconstitutional. Some other states have considered similar laws. Lawmakers in Texas and Utah also considered bills that would have required the posting of the Ten Commandments in public schools. Now, neither of those passed. In Texas, the measure didn't get through, but the state's Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, has vowed to bring it back next year. Utah's bill was watered down to allow but not require the Ten Commandments to be used as part of the school curriculum. So we're dealing with a situation here where, again, this is being done for devotional purposes, not legitimate educational purposes. If you had a comparative religion class and you were talking about the different things that religions believe and you wanted to bring the Ten Commandments into that discussion, that could probably be done in a legitimate educational way. But this is the posting of these documents for devotional purposes. And we're going to fight that in court as much as we can. The next issue we're dealing with is the use of the Bible in public schools in inappropriate ways. Not long after Louisiana passed its Ten Commandments law, Ryan Walters, who's the controversial superintendent of public instruction in Oklahoma, apparently had a bad case of jealousy because he issued a directive from his office asserting that the Bible should be incorporated into all public school lessons. And he threatened to fire any teacher who did not comply. Now, this is complicated for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's unclear that Ryan Walters even has the legal authority to issue directives like that. State law in Oklahoma tends to leave curriculum matters in the hands of the local schools and their elected school boards. In fact, several districts in Oklahoma have already stated that they will not follow Walter's directive. Secondly, as Americans United has pointed out, objective instruction about religion is permissible in public schools, and the Bible's impact on art and literature and history can be discussed. But this doesn't appear to be what Walters wants, because as a Christian nationalist, he seems to be advocating for a more devotional use of the Bible in public education. And that, of course, is a problem. Americans United, along with the groups I mentioned, is continuing to monitor this situation. We have sent a formal request to Walters' office under the Freedom of Information Act, requesting all the records related to this Bible mandate. Now, this was made under an Oklahoma Open Records Act, but historically, state officials in that state tend to drag their feet on these requests. But we aren't going to let up. This is a situation where the Bible is being used not for legitimate educational instruction, but for devotional purposes. And we simply can't allow that to happen in our public schools, which must serve children from many different religious backgrounds, as well as those who have no religious perspective. The next issue is chaplains in public schools. And it is amazing to me sitting here that I even have to talk about this. It's absolutely remarkable. As recently as 15 years ago, this wouldn't have even been a discussion. Nobody would have seriously argued that you could have a religious chaplain operating in a public school. Now, chaplains have their place in society. Military chaplains, you're probably very familiar with. The House and the Senate have chaplains. Hospital chaplains. Chaplains are common in prisons. The idea of a chaplain, however, is that he or she is serving a population that, for whatever reason, they've been removed from their home congregation. If you're in the military and you're stationed overseas, obviously you can't go to your home church. If you're in prison, you can't leave and go to your home church. If you're in a hospital and you're sick, you can't go to church or a house of worship. So a chaplain tends to your needs. Well, public schools aren't like that. Children attending public schools have every opportunity to engage in religious activity with their parents at whatever time they decide to do that, and whatever house of worship they decide to attend. The states that have been looking at instituting these chaplains, and so far it's Texas and Florida, have argued that the chaplains are needed because there's a shortage of school counselors. A couple things to say about that. If there's a shortage of school counselors, it's because there was a shortage of funding. So give them the funding and hire more counselors. Secondly, school counselors and chaplains are not the same job. A school counselor provides psychological care or professional guidance for students trying to figure out what they want to do in the future, that sort of thing. A chaplain provides spiritual guidance. It's two different jobs. And certainly in the public education system, the idea of somebody officially coming in to provide spiritual guidance is problematic, and parents ought to be concerned about this. How did they know that the spiritual guidance being provided is in accord with what they're teaching their children at home? The backers of these measures have given away the game. In Texas, the law's sponsor, a state senator named Mays Middleton from Galveston, had a clear religious motivation in mind for pushing the bill. During debate over the measure, Middleton remarked that chaplains, quote, represent God in our government. Earlier this year, Americans United endorsed 3 open letters to state legislators all across the country, opposing this wave of bills to install chaplains in public schools. In this letter, nearly 36 public policy organizations and 40 faith organizations and 200 chaplains themselves opposed the idea of bringing chaplains into public schools. The chaplains said that as trained chaplains, they cautioned against a government assertion of authority for spiritual development and formation of our public school children. They argued that families and religious institutions are the ones to make this type of sensitive decision, not a chaplain operating in a public school. Well, once again, we are kind of left to figure out what's going on. In Texas, according to initial reports, even though Texas is a gigantic state with more than 1,000 public school districts, only one had gone through and put a chaplain in place. In Florida, where the chaplain bill has also been passed, several districts considered it, but they backed off because non-Christian organizations said, well, if you're going to have a Christian chaplain in the school, we'd like to provide one too. And suddenly they weren't so eager to do a chaplain if they were going to have to provide a whole range of them. So that's another thing we've been looking at. Another issue that's been popping up around the country is something that you may not have read about, but is kind of occurring under the radar. And these are videos, misleading videos about history and separation of church and state, put out by an outfit called PragerU. Now, PragerU is not a university, despite its name. It's a Christian nationalist organization that distorts history. Despite its distortion of history, its videos have been cleared for optional use in 6 states: Florida, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Montana, Arizona, and Louisiana. The PragerU videos, which spring from a nonprofit founded by a conservative talk radio show host named Dennis Prager, have espoused views that are anti-LGBTQ+, anti-women, anti-Muslim, anti-science, and the videos also whitewash the troubled racial history of our own nation. They are skeptical of climate change, they scorn feminism, they attack the idea of gender fluidity, and they promote various other right-wing causes. Americans United, which has pointed out the faults in many of these videos, once again, stepping into the fray, we have been filing public records requests in all of these states, trying to figure out, first of all, how many schools are using these videos, how was this approved, was it approved, who approved it. Once we get these public documents in hand, we can decide what we want to do, if we want to pursue litigation or try other avenues for getting this misleading material out of our schools. Next issue I'm going to touch on is creationism. This is something that has been a constant in American public education, unfortunately, and for the past several decades. The idea that you would teach a biblical account of the creation of the world alongside established science. Sometimes creationism these days is called by a more up-to-date term, intelligent design, but it's still a problem. Bills advocating for creationism are usually defeated, but one did sweep through last year in West Virginia. It's a very oddly worded bill that states that no public school shall be prohibited from discussing various theories about the origin of the earth or how life came into existence. So to us, this sounds like a bit of an attempt to bring creationism in through the back door. So we're watching how that unfolds and have put the word out to our contacts in West Virginia that if anything is happening in schools that they feel is problematic, because again, the precedent right now as it stands is on our side. Teaching creationism is religious doctrine and it's unconstitutional. We can bring these matters to the attention of the schools and hopefully get them to change course. The next issue I want to touch on is book banning, and this has been a problem around the country. We seem to go through waves of this in the United States, peaks and valleys, periods where books are being censored, books are being attacked, then things die down, then it starts up again. This current wave of book banning is being spearheaded by a group called Moms for Liberty and some other Christian nationalist organizations that are mainly attacking books that have LGBTQ plus content. PEN America, a group that opposes censorship, earlier this year, reported that it documented 3,362 instances of school book bans and also in public school libraries in classrooms from the period of July 2022 through June 2023. These book bans assailed access to 1,557 unique book titles. The works of over 1,400 authors and illustrators were targeted. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the books most often attacked have LGBTQ plus themes or have characters from that community. Schools continue to have these pressures to remove this material. PEN America reported that 40% of all book bans occurred in just one state, Florida. Texas was second with 625 bans, followed by Missouri, 333, Utah, 281, and sadly, my home state of Pennsylvania with 186. Oftentimes, the claim is made that books are pornographic. These groups will claim these books are pornographic. They can't be in the schools. The books are not pornographic. There is a legal definition of obscenity. Obviously, these books aimed at children and young audiences come nowhere near that definition. And in fact, the question of what is too racy for people to read has been around for a long time. And a lot of books that we now consider classics, like The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck and F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and others, were attacked as allegedly being obscene when they were first published in the 1920s and 30s, even though they are in no way close to the legal definition and don't even contain obscenity or sex. So that is just an argument people are using to try to scare the public and inflame public opinion that the books are obscene, the books are dirty. Be aware of that. Those are the threats dealing with religion in public education. I want to take just a couple of seconds to talk about what's permissible in public schools when it comes to this issue and what's not. I touched on this a little bit, but I want to go into just a few minutes of a little more detail. I want to be clear. Voluntary, non-disruptive prayer is allowed in public schools and always has been. A student can pray before they eat their lunch or the beginning of the day or before they take a test or whatever they want, as long as it's not forced on them and as long as they're not being disruptive. Students can form and run religious clubs at the secondary school level. There's a federal law that allows this. The clubs are student-run. They can be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, atheist, Hindu, Wiccan, pagan, lots of different religious and non-religious expressions. Students can get together voluntarily at these clubs, which meet during non-instructional time, usually right at the end of the school day. And they can pray. They can read religious books. They can talk about their faith. They can share the faith with one another. Nobody's required to be there. So that's permitted. Objective study about religion is permitted in our public schools. Again, always has been. Talking about religion's role in art and history and literature. Even comparative religion can be offered, usually as an elective, but it can be offered. The approach must be fair, objective, and balanced. And when we're talking about religion's role in history, we have to talk about the positive and the negative, or we're not doing a fair job. So some of the material imparted is not always going to be favorable to religion, but it must be discussed. Religious themes, students can incorporate religious themes into their school assignments when it's relevant. If students are asked to do a book report and they can read any book, then they can read a religious book. But if they're asked to read a book that deals with a certain aspect of society and a religious book wouldn't fill that role, then they might not be able to. But certainly these religious themes can be included. I say this because there is this great myth out there that somehow there's no place for religion at all in our public schools. It can exist, but it must be voluntarily chosen. That means the things that are not okay are coercive, school-sponsored prayer and Bible reading, such as was struck down by the court in the early 1960s. Assemblies with religious content where preachers come into school and try to witness to children, completely inappropriate. Teachers and staff members proselytizing to children, trying to get them to change their religion, change their views, not permitted. Teaching about religion in a biased manner, holding up the Bible as true, attacking evolution, that's not permitted. And celebrating religious holidays as religious events, also not permitted. They can be discussed as their cultural impact, but not celebrated as religious events. So that's a little bit about religion in schools. Now I want to pivot and talk a little bit about funding, because these issues really do go hand in hand. There are people, as I mentioned earlier, who don't really believe in the concept of public education. And what they would like instead is some kind of network of taxpayer-funded, private, mostly Christian schools. Well, our founding fathers were very concerned about the idea of anybody being taxed to pay for someone else's religion. In 1785, Patrick Henry in Virginia proposed a bill that would have required all residents to pay a tax to support, quote, teachers of the Christian religion. It was a church tax. In response, James Madison crafted a document called the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, which is essentially a list of 15 reasons why no one should have to pay church taxes. And through Madison's eloquence, the Henry Bill was defeated. For many years, the Supreme Court was wary of taxpayer support for religion, especially voucher programs for secondary schools. A few states attempted them, but they were struck down. Most private religious schools in America are, I'm sorry, most private schools in America are religious, 77%. This means that voucher programs will inevitably end up subsidizing religious education most of the time. But in the 1980s, the court became more conservative, thanks to appointments during the first Reagan and first Bush term. In 2001, the Supreme Court reversed course and upheld a voucher program in Ohio. Now, it took some time, but states began passing these plans to fund religious schools and other types of private schools, but again, mostly religious. Voucher plans or similar programs that fund religious schools now exist in 21 states. In addition, there is a federally funded program that operates in Washington, D.C. These plans continue to proliferate, even though they are not popular with the voters. Every single time voters have had the opportunity to deal with a voucher plan as a ballot question, as an initiative or a referendum, they have voted them down, oftentimes by margins of 2-1. The politicians don't care. In 2017, lawmakers in Arizona passed a bill expanding that state's small voucher plan that had been limited to certain types of students with special needs. They expanded it to cover every student in the state. Concerned residents gathered more than 75,000 signatures to put the matter on the ballot in November of 2018. On election day, the vote was not close. 65% of the voters voted against the voucher plan at the ballot. Unfazed, state lawmakers waited until the legislature went back into session and passed the same plan again. It is remarkable that these things can happen, but they do. Now we have to consider these schools, private religious schools, they're not like public schools. They're not like our common schools that educate everybody. They oftentimes will teach in a way that elevates their dogma over education. They may teach creationism in lieu of evolution and sound science. They may teach a distorted view of history that tells children that our nation was founded to be officially Christian, even though our Constitution says nothing about that. They whitewash the troubled racial history of the country. They overlook it. They discriminate. LGBTQ plus teachers can be fired. Students of that persuasion can be kicked out or denied admission. Public schools can't do any of this. Essentially, these private religious schools, although they are tax funded in 21 states and in Washington, D.C., are beyond the reach of the law. There is no serious accountability. Now, why does this matter? It goes back to what I talked about earlier. Remember, common schools, common, public, the common good, the public good. It seems an obvious point that there are certain institutions that are designed to benefit us all. Public schools are one of them. And you know what? We all pay for things we don't directly use. And I bring this up because sometimes people say, well, why should I pay for public schools? I don't have any children, or my children are grown, or I never used the public schools. Well, I would say to you that these institutions are providing public benefit. It is in our best interest for our children to be educated. It's in no one's interest for them to remain ignorant. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we all pay for programs we do not directly use. Young people pay for programs that are limited to senior citizens. People who don't know how to swim still pay for a municipal pool. People who don't like to read still pay taxes to support a library. The common good, the public good, this idea that we have certain institutions that are benefiting our entire society, and it's good that we support them. I want to say a couple other things about vouchers before I wrap up, and then I'll take your questions. One is that, remarkably, despite the proliferation of these plans, no study shows that they are working. Advocates told us that the voucher students would do better academically than their peers in public schools. There is no academic support for that proposition. And the remarkable thing about it is they ought to be doing better. The private schools ought to be doing better because they often cream the best students. They can reject admission to students if they don't think they're academically performing very well. Yet, Studies of voucher plans that have come out to date, and they've been done objectively by major universities, have found voucher students and public school students performing at about the same rate academically. Private schools, homeschooling, other types of private experiences are very lightly or absolutely not regulated in this country, even when they're tax funded. Consider the amount of regulations that public schools must meet to make sure they're serving the public. Well, the private institutions, even though they're taking your tax money, are free from all of that. And you often hear people talk about school choice. That's a euphemism oftentimes for these voucher plans. We have school choice. We have charter schools. We have public school choice. That isn't enough for some of these individuals. What they want really is a system of taxpayer-funded private education. And eventually, I think, the demise of the public education system. Now, people sometimes say, well, isn't that a little bit extreme? But having looked at these organizations and watched what they're trying to do over the years, I am concerned because there is a sort of a strange marriage between fundamentalist Christians, Christian nationalists, who hate public education, who don't like public institutions, and the anti-government faction, which oftentimes tends to be more secular, but also has a disdain for anything the government is doing. So these two forces have come together, and they're trying to tear down not only our public schools, but a lot of public institutions. And if you read Project 2025, which as many of you know, is a blueprint for government in 2025, so a certain candidate be elected, they call for tearing down or severely cutting the funding of a lot of different public institutions. And in the case of education, they would eliminate the Department of Education and severely restrict the federal funding, which is not generous to begin with, but they want to restrict it even more. Now, are some of our public schools troubled? Some of them need more support. Absolutely. We know that. But we also know that the answer for troubled institutions is not to throw up your hands and turn your back on them, but to find ways to help them. Find ways to help all of our children succeed. Because that is one of the things that the public school system has done over the years, opening its arms up to all kinds of different students. Students who are poor, middle class, wealthy, students who speak English proficiently and those who are struggling, students of different racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds, national heritage, different life experiences as they've come up, single parent children, multi-parent children, all welcomed with the public school saying, it doesn't matter who your parents are, where you come from, we will educate you here. Now, it isn't often that I quote President James Garfield, but I'm going to do that as I wrap up. President Garfield, many of you, if you know anything about him at all, you may remember that he was one of our presidents who unfortunately was assassinated. He was our 20th president. When President Garfield was offered the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1880, he accepted it with a letter, and he talked about his perspective on a number of issues. Here's what he had to say about public education. Whatever help the nation can justly afford should be generously given to the states in supporting common schools. But it would be unjust to our people and dangerous to our institutions to apply any portion of the revenues of the nation or of the states to the support of sectarian schools. The separation of church and state in everything relating to taxation should be absolute. Some wise words from James Garfield. Let's carry them forth. Thank you, and now I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
Hi, everybody. It's Louise again. I just wanted to remind you to use the Q&A function, not the chat function, and putting your questions in, and then I will feed them to Rob, and he will answer them. Rob, so far we have 3 questions, but they're coming in, so I think everybody listened to it, what we said about holding off. The first one says, "Hi, Rob. Bob Ritter here, former legal coordinator and staff attorney for the American Humanist Association. Starting in 1955 in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, the Fraternity Order of Eagles erected more than 170 of their 198 Ten Commandments monuments on public property. Do you think that the early 1960s prayer cases by the ACLU and Jewish groups zapped their energy to oppose the Fraternal Order of Eagles Ten Commandment monuments until circa 1990s, eventually leading to the Van Orden versus Perry in 2005?
Yeah, the situation with those Ten Commandments monuments is very troubling. As the questioner points out, a lot of those sprang from the 1950s during a time when, as I talked earlier, there was a lot of what was called civil religion around. This idea that the government could promote religion in this kind of generic way, and God we trust, and so on. There were challenges to a lot of those monuments in the 1990s, and many of them were successful. But the Supreme Court, again, began to shift on these questions, and in a case from a few years ago, upheld the display of a very large towering cross on public land in Bladensburg, Maryland, holding that it could be grandfathered in because it had some kind of allegedly historic significance. It had been there a long time. I find the argument that a constitutional violation somehow gains approval because of the passage of time to be nonsensical, but that's where we are with the Supreme Court right now. So those Ten Commandments monuments right now, I think, would be challenging it would be difficult to challenge them in court.
Thank you. Helene Bussinger Chassett has a comment or question. Do you believe, as most of us do, that equal access to education is the fundamental right for our children, and that only publicly funded public schools can guarantee that right to our children?
I do believe that. I think that's a very good point. One of the topics that I tried to stress during my remarks was the idea of common schools, public schools. They're serving everybody. I mean, think about, and I don't mean to disparage private education, because for some people that certainly is an option that they want to use. But remember, these institutions don't have to accept all comers. They get to decide who they'll let in and who they will deny admission to. And as long as they have that ability, they're just operating under an entirely different set of strictures and laws. They're not going to be the system that can educate the masses. And many of them aren't interested in being that system. So we really need to be, I think, supporting our public education system, which, as I mentioned during my remarks, educates 90% of our children. That's where the focus and the funding should be.
Thank you. Marjorie Seiner poses the question, how do we determine whose religious views take precedence? For example, in cases over objections to employer-funded birth control under the ACA.
Well, that's really a problem right now, that the Supreme Court adopting what I think is a rather extreme interpretation of religious freedom, allowing people to take away the rights of others. Religious freedom I think it's an individual right, and it can also be a corporate right in the sense that houses of worship have protections for what they're doing and so on. But it's not a right that gives you the ability to harm somebody else or take away their rights. If you oppose birth control, if you have a serious religiously based objection to birth control, the answer is don't use it. But what we're seeing now is employers making that decision for other people. And that's the real problem. So I think we need to get back to an understanding of religious freedom that recognizes that it is not a license to do harm to anybody else. So you get to make decisions for yourself, but not for other people.
Thank you. John Parks asked the question, do you believe that no taxpayer money should be given to private schools?
I believe that public funding should be reserved for public institutions and public schools. In those cases where some type of public funds may be extended, and I don't generally favor that, but if it were, I would say there would need to be a lot of conditions on that money. And right now we have a situation where private religious schools take your tax money and then turn around and say, well, we're not admitting any students who are LGBTQ+. We're not admitting any students who don't sign our statement of faith. We're not admitting any students if their parents aren't married. We're just a whole list of reasons we're not admitting any students. And by the way, we're not going to teach real science. We're going to teach this junk history. Don't try to tell us where a curriculum will be. We're going to do what we want. Look, when the state funds something, it has an obligation to establish some type of control over how that money is used. And right now, private schools, it seems to me, they want to have the best of both worlds. They want all the money they can get from the public and absolutely none of the oversight. And that just simply shouldn't be the case.
Thank you. Mary Levering asked the question, to what extent do real estate taxes fund public schools, and what effect does that have on the quality of public education available in a district?
Yes, that is the mechanism by which public schools tend to be funded in this country, property taxes. And that has resulted in a system of unequal funding. I'm not an expert in this area, but I do know that there are activists working on this question as well, to equalize the funding, to find other mechanisms for provision of funding in a way that ensures that a wealthy area, because most of the people are very wealthy and are paying a lot more in taxes, don't have a school system that represents them and works a lot better for them than it would be in a poor area. I mentioned during my remarks at the end about how we do have some work to do, and we do. And one of the areas we need to do is to equalize funding as much as we can and ensure that the experience that students are having is good across the board. And we're not there yet, but that's no reason to stop trying.
Okay, thank you. Carol Cochran asks, is it true that that private schools do not have to give the same achievement tests as public schools?
Usually not. As I mentioned during my remarks, private schools are generally free to set their own policies and determine how they're going to do things. One of the things that's made it a little bit challenging sometimes to even figure out what's going on in some of the private schools is that they will say, look, we're private institutions. We don't want to have any oversight. Now, if they were not receiving money through voucher plans, I actually would be sympathetic to that argument. I would let them kind of do their own thing. What bothers me is the assertion that, well, we want to get all this public money, as much as we can get from the taxpayers, and we still don't want anybody looking into what we're doing or trying to make sure that our students are graduating or have a minimum competency in these areas. This is mainly a problem, to be honest, in the fundamentalist Christian academies. Certainly, a lot of the secular private schools, which are very well-heeled, and honestly, many of them aren't interested in voucher plans because they serve a well-off population. They're going to be providing a pretty good education. A lot of Roman Catholic schools will do a decent job. But it's these fundamentalist academies where you suddenly find that you don't know what's being taught in some of these schools. And it certainly isn't modern science or legitimate history. And oftentimes they rely on curriculum materials produced by groups that put out a lot of troubling material. Let's put it that way.
There are no other questions in the queue, but I had actually two questions for you. Homeschooling, how is that funded, and how do you control that at all? Not control, control's a bad word.
Yes, well, there are some voucher plans in states that allow for support for homeschooling, as remarkable as that might be. That does happen. Now, people engage in homeschooling for lots of different reasons. And again, I don't want to disparage those who are doing it for something, for a reason that they consider to be very legitimate and what have you. But there's also a trend among a lot of Christian fundamentalists to engage in homeschooling because they view the public school system as evil, as anti-religion, and they want their children to be taught these other things instead. And again, as much as I disagree with some of what those folks are teaching, I would support their right to do it without my tax dollars. But now we're finding them saying, we want that tax support, we want public support, and then we don't want any oversight. Again, if we're going to allow these types of systems to exist, there has to be some mechanism in place that ensures that the children are meeting at least some minimum level of competency. Because it's a home school, we don't know what's going on in there. Are they actually being taught anything? And by the time a kid graduates and is trying to engage the larger world, it's a little bit too late. So I do think, certainly in the cases where there's public funding being extended, that it's appropriate for the state to have mechanisms in place that ensure that there's some legitimate instruction occurring there. There are some nations that don't even allow homeschooling because they see it as too problematic in that regard. We allow it here, and that's fine, but we shouldn't allow it just unfettered. There has to be some control and oversight.
Okay. My last question, unless somebody else would like to chime in, somebody's made a comment to you. Right on, Rob. So you have fans out here. So for those of us listening to you talk today, what can we do to further the cause? One is to be educated, certainly, about it.
Yes,
But
thank you for that question. I would say one of the most important things people can do is support these public institutions that are under attack, whether it's a public school or a public library. And remember, as I said earlier, don't make the mistake of thinking that your voice doesn't matter because you are not directly using the system anymore. My wife and I have two girls. They're fully grown adults now. They're out in the world doing their own thing. They went to public schools. And we frequented the library all the time when they were little. It would be easy for me to say, well, I'm not really using those schools anymore. I don't go to the library so much. What do I care? But I do care because there's another generation of kids coming up behind mine who need access to those same systems. And those same systems are under attack. To my mind, one of the worst things a person can do in this world, when you've kind of climbed up the ladder to some kind of success and come up from maybe a difficult period or whatever you might have had, is to turn your back on the person who's coming up behind you. You need to turn around and extend your hand to that person. Pull them up too. That's how we should look at our public institutions. Yeah, maybe your kids are grown and they're not in public school anymore, but your neighbor's kids are in that school system. The people on the block have kids in that school system. People across town, people you don't even know. Why would you want there to not be a system that's going to work for your entire community? It lifts up your entire community when we have these programs. And one of the most important things that individuals can do, and I tell this all the time in my speeches, is simply show up. I know it's challenging. We're all busy. But when the school board meets, Moms for Liberty is going to be there ranting and raving. You need to be there. When your public library is under attack and people are trying to force books out of the collection, the Christian nationalist groups are going to be there loudly protesting. The library board or the county board of supervisors or the city council, whoever has ultimate control, needs to hear your voice as well. One of the things we have learned, and I've seen this repeatedly over the years, is that when people show up, it does make a difference. It absolutely does. Don't think, oh, it's pointless. It's a lost cause. No, it's not. We have seen many cases recently where because citizens got engaged, they've turned back censorship efforts. They've turned back efforts to violate the religious neutrality of public education. People absolutely need to speak up. And then obviously the other things are pretty obvious, voting, finding out where candidates stand. I know it's challenging when you have school board races and there may be, a dozen people running for a seat. Take some time and do some research. Those candidates are going to have websites. There are going to be reports about them. You want to smoke out the candidates who are running on the Christian nationalist platforms. Usually it becomes kind of obvious. It's not my job to tell anybody who to vote for, but be educated about where these candidates stand, because in some of these low turnout elections, that's how these extremists get in, because they're busy, they're not paying enough attention. You pay attention to the national races, you pay attention to the Senate races, the local races are extremely important as well. So just do your research, share your research. There are organizations out there that provide information about local candidates, teachers unions, and League of Women Voters, and other organizations that will help you make an informed decision. So those are the sorts of things that you can do. And lastly, I would say this, especially in the case of public education, direct support of the schools is welcome. The average public education teacher in this country is not well compensated. They can use your help. We've all heard the stories about how much money out of their own pockets that teachers will spend every year for school supplies. Well, you can donate. There are funds that will distribute that money to teachers through gift cards so they don't have to spend their own money. There may be volunteer opportunities for you in the public school system. There's things that you can do just to show your support. It's not an easy job. I've never been a public school teacher, but my wife was for a little while, and I have sisters who have done that work, and I know I've just had friends, and I know how hard it is. It's certainly not a 40-hour-a-week job. It's a lot more. and people can get burned out. And if all we ever get is negative attacks from these extremist organizations, it's easy for them to walk away. They need to hear some words of support, and you are in a position to provide that.
Well, you inspired four more questions. So you might not be able to leave early today.
Let's do it.
My dog's barking. Rob Ritter asked the question, parents who homeschool or send their kids to religious schools also pay property taxes. Would fairness dictate allocating school money on a per child basis?
I don't think so. I think that's a mistake. I think what we need to really look at here is that we're again providing for the common good, not just your individual preference. And as I said, you end up paying taxes for a lot of things you don't actually use. Or if you choose to duplicate a government service, you don't get a kickback. Like I could say, I have a lot of books in my house. I have my own home library. I don't want to pay taxes for the public library. It doesn't work that way. You don't get a rebate because you've chosen to duplicate a government service.
Thank you. Yolanda Laser asked the question, are you aware of how much corruption of publicly funded non-public schools paying the dollars to enrich the school staffs rather than towards education? We do not know. I'm not exactly sure how that.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that question's all about, but
Yeah.
I think in any public institution, there is always the possibility of problems and financial malfeasance. But public institutions, unlike private ones, usually have a mechanism in place, some type of office, some type of accountability to bring that sort of thing to light if it happens. And then it can be corrected. And the people who have engaged in the malfeasance can be punished. The problem with the private institutions is they're oftentimes just beyond the reach of the law when it comes to cases like that. We've had situations over the years where fly-by-night schools have been set up to take vouchers, and they're really not providing any serious education. And because there's not oversight, no one finds out about this until it's too late. Well, that's really harmful to children. That probably is not going to happen in a publicly funded institution.
Okay. Jerome Hoganson asks, with respect to book bans in libraries and schools, what scope is there for the community to determine that some materials may not be age appropriate and access may therefore should be limited?
I do think that there's meaningful dialogue that can occur at the community level in cases like that. And I think librarians are happy to engage in that dialogue. You're right. The questioner is right. There is some material that is designed for adult audiences or maybe young adult audiences that shouldn't be in the hands of, say, kids in kindergarten or first grade or second grade. That's why most libraries will have, a section for children, young children, and have other materials in other parts of the building and so on. One of the things I would say is useful there is for parents to always be engaged in these types of visits to libraries, help children find material that's appropriate for them, and steer them away from material that's designed for children of an older age. So parental involvement is necessary. I've worked with some of the professional library associations, and one of the things that I often hear there is that they are happy to have legitimate parental involvement. They want community feedback. They want to find ways to get material into the hands of students when it's age appropriate. What concerns them is people who come in and say, this book offends me or offends my religion, therefore nobody should be able to get it. We want it out of the system. That's censorship. That's an entirely different thing. It's common sense that some materials will be structured to age-appropriate audiences, but that's still available. The actual removal, the absolute removal of the material is far, far removed from that.
Thank you. Yolanda also made the comment that local school race research is hindered by the demise of local newspapers. And I guess all of these issues.
Well, that could be another speech. I was a journalism major in college, and I feel very strongly about this and sad to see the demise of local media. Absolutely. But I also think that some of these attacks on a more honest reckoning of racial relations does come top down from state governments. And it's part of a calculated effort to inflame public opinion and get people to vote in a certain way. Let's put it that way. So, there are sometimes ulterior motives behind these attacks.
Thank you. God, thank you. One last question, and I don't think anybody will chime in. We've opened it up for questions a couple of times. Can you ask Rob if students in religious schools have to take makeup classes because time was spent on religious versus academic learning?
Yeah, again, that's going to be something that the religious private school is going to decide how much time is spent on this sort of thing. There because there's very little oversight, it's hard to tell how much time is devoted to secular subjects. In fact, some private religious schools brag that they don't have any secular learning, that their particular religious perspective permeates all aspects of the curriculum, even subjects like math. They find ways to make them more religious. So it's definitely a concern. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to let folks know that if you want to learn more about these issues, the Americans United website is very easy to remember. It's au.org, so au.org. And you can go there and learn more about the role of religion in public education, vouchers, all these issues we've been talking about, the threat of Christian nationalism, information about the history of separation of church and state and how we got that principle, and debunking the idea of America being an officially Christian nation. So I would recommend that you check out our site. And if you have any questions after this event, you can always feel free to reach out to me through the website, and I'll be happy to help you as much as I can.
Great, thank you. Also, I would ask everybody to fill in the survey about today's presentation. Rob, I'm seeing a visual on my screen showing applause and people's thumbs up. So I think
I
that means
appreciate
that everybody appreciated your conversation and your thoughtful answers. And I think more and more of them are coming up. So you have a fan club out there. This is just a great presentation, and I'm not surprised because I heard your other presentation earlier a few years ago, actually, and it's germane or more today than it was then. And thank you very much for being an expert in this for us and sharing that with us.
Well, thank you, and thanks to everyone for tuning in this afternoon. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and don't forget to fill in the